presentation on restructuring the American immigration system. According to the organization VERA, 70% of people in detention had no attorney from 2016 later, and immigrants are 10 times as likely to establish the right to remain in the U.S. with an attorney. Many immigrants, here legally or not, are denied protections under U.S. law, such as due process, which applies to everyone in the country regardless of their legal status. These continued denials of fair treatment of immigrants brings into question the ethicality of U.S. immigration policy. In the U.S., immigrants are legally sorted into 4 legal status groups. These include naturalized citizens, legal immigrants, legal non-immigrants, and undocumented immigrants. These groups have different legal rights and privilege from each other, with naturalized citizens having the most and undocumented migrants having the least. Through executive orders and actions starting in 2017, the U.S. government has been prosecuting people heavier for entering or re-entering the U.S. without authorization. As immigrant rights are continually ignored by immigration policy and immigration court rulings, it becomes an increasingly important issue as it questions the ethicality of immigration policy. So the thematic connection between the two stimulus materials I use is triumph through adversity, because Elise Cobell achieved her goal of equality and sufficient pay for Native Americans and their assets, and the inaugural address by FDR shows the theme of triumph through adversity because it argues for the American people to keep working and fighting through the hard economic times to prosper again. So there are 2 different perspectives on solving this issue, which are that the immigration system works, but it needs to be adjusted in order to be fair. So this perspective offers the solution that that the immigration system in the U.S. needs to be added onto, either by providing a path for undocumented immigrants to become citizens, or by providing more resources and immigration judges. So the second perspective says that the immigration system is to blame entirely for injustices faced by immigrants, and this offers the solution that we need to rebuild the U.S. immigration system entirely, so that immigrants have more legal protection, but we would have to completely replace the system. So replacing the entire immigration system can be challenging, but will be more beneficial and long-lasting. Despite being hard to enforce, replacing the American immigration system altogether is the best way to tackle unjust immigration cases, because it would create a more just legal system and it would strengthen the economy. So my first reason why we should rebuild the U.S. immigration system is that it would create a just system for immigrants. So rebuilding the American immigration system entirely would need to include 4 parts: changing legal pathways, providing a path to legalization for undocumented migrants, making more humane refugee policies, and enforcing immigrants' due process rights. So changing legal pathways, along with a path to legalization for undocumented migrants, allows immigrants living undocumented in the U.S. to legally live without benefiting the community and economy as a whole, while living without fear of prosecution. Humane refugee policies and enforcement of due process rights are parts of the U.S. immigration system which need to be changed. Implementing these changes would make the overall immigration reform to correct 2 major injustices. Making humane refugee policies would protect immigrants from being unjustly detained and being sent back to their countries after trying to flee violence and other problems from their home countries. Enforcing due process rights of immigrants would protect them from common cases of immigrants being detained without due process of law and not being able to fight back. My second reason is that rebuilding the U.S. immigration system would strengthen our economy. So according to the Bipartisan Policy Organization, meaningful reform to our immigration system could decrease the federal deficit by $1.2 trillion in 20 years. This would greatly strengthen the economy, as reducing federal debt reduces the probability of recession, and it adds to the demand and purchase power of the private sector, according to Robert Eisner of Harvard Business Review. According to Stephen C. Goss, the chief actuary of the Social Security Administration, meaningful reform would create over 3 million jobs within a decade, another big benefit to the economy from immigration reform. According to Goss, a restructured immigration system with a path to legalization would result in more tax revenue, as untaxed immigrant workers would become documented residents. Creating a path for untaxed immigrant workers and non-immigrants would create approximately $276 million extra dollars in tax revenue over 10 years. This would help to decrease the federal deficit and create new jobs for the unemployed. These benefits to the economy can only be enacted through immigration reform with a path to legalization, like total immigration reform would accomplish. So, some limitations of my solution include that it is harder to completely replace the immigration system than to add on to it. And anti-immigration movements and gridlock oppose policymaking about changing the unjust immigration system. So, according to the Pew Research Center, 45% of Americans know that most immigrants are here legally. That's less than half. Most Americans feel sympathy for unauthorized immigrants. Most Americans do not think that undocumented immigrants are more likely to commit a crime. Most Americans are not bothered by immigrants who do not speak English well. Most Americans do not think undocumented immigrants take wanted jobs. From these public opinion statistics, the conclusion that most Americans would approve of changing the unjust immigration system can be reasonably made. However, a plurality of Republicans still think the amount of legal immigration into the U.S. should be decreased, as opposed to Democrats. Rebuilding the immigration system entirely would result in increasing the amount of immigrants legally entering the U.S. So this reform would lose support from Republicans, which would increase political polarization and in turn increase gridlock, making it harder for reform to happen. Despite these limitations and unwanted implications, we should still try to rebuild the immigration system because most Americans would agree with it and is a more sure way to abolish injustice committed against immigrants. These are my works cited. Thank you.
I got your works cited in there.
Okay.
Okay. So let's. You ready for your oral defense? First of all, how did some preliminary information you gathered inform your research?
So some preliminary information that I gathered that informed my research were some news stories about the immigrants in the U.S. being deprived of their parental rights without due process of law, and the Supreme Court of the United States had a ruling about the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms being taken away from undocumented immigrants, which caused a lot of controversy.
Okay. And what additional questions emerged from your research, and why are these questions important?
One additional question that evolved from my research was about how gridlock and political polarization affects policymaking on immigration reform in the U.S. So, how despite most Americans in the United States support reform of the immigration system, the way our political system works, reform wouldn't pass in Congress.